A very good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. A very warm welcome from all of us here on a sunny and beautiful day in Singapore. Thank you so much for taking time off your busy schedules to join us. I see that we have quite a big audience. My name is Lian Pin. I am the moderator for our session today. By way of a quick introduction, I am a professor of conservation science at the National University of Singapore. I'm also director of the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at the university. In the wake of a changing climate is a four-part panel discussion series jointly organized by the HIT Foundation and our research center. This exciting new series will explore the water, energy, and food nexus in the context of a changing and warming climate. I should also quickly introduce our two organizations. The HIT Foundation was established in 2013. Its goal is to help improve the lives of people in Asia by disseminating knowledge and sharing ideas, and by supporting and funding sustainable education and healthcare projects that develop social and human capital. The Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions was established just last year in 2020. The center is a focal point for research, thought leadership, and education on nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. It produces policy-relevant science and builds capacity in the public, private, and people sectors to help achieve a carbon-neutral economy and stable global climate. Now, our introductory session today will explore the complexities, the interdependencies, and the interconnectedness of the three big challenges of water, energy, and food security that we face as a global society. As the world emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, our demand for all three resources will likely increase, and rapidly too. In fact, by some pre-COVID estimates, global food production will need to increase by 50% to feed an expected global population of 9 billion people by 2050. And that will almost certainly increase our water demands as well. Now, almost 3/4 of all water withdrawals are used for agriculture. Global water demand is projected to increase by around 20 to 30% by 2050. But food production is not only water intensive, it is also energy intensive. The global food production and supply chain accounts for almost 30% of total global energy consumption. Of course, there is also an interaction between water and energy. In fact, energy production is highly water intensive. For example, a power plant cooling is responsible for 43% of total freshwater withdrawals in Europe, nearly 50% in the US, and 10% in China. Global energy demand is expected to increase by at least 50% by 2030. There's, of course, a great deal of effort invested in developing solutions to these problems. For example, in terms of food production, efficiency gains through precision irrigation can help reduce water and energy requirements. In terms of energy production, higher efficiency power plants with more advanced cooling systems can also help reduce water withdrawal demands. Therefore, while the interactions between water, energy, and food demands can pose complex challenges for society, by the same token, these interactions also create opportunities for novel and impactful solutions. Importantly, as we discuss, debate, and deliberate on the problems and solutions around this water, energy, and food nexus, we must not forget to frame our conversations within the broader context of the Sustainable Development Goals, which would include several other priorities, such as poverty alleviation, biodiversity conservation, and of course, addressing climate change as a global emergency. To help us fathom these wicked problems are three world-leading scientists and thought leaders who graciously give us their precious time today. We have Dr. Hesri Adnan, Associate Professor Catherine Mach, and Professor Chris Field. They will be speaking for about 15 minutes each and in that order. After their presentations, we will have a 15-minute discussion among the panelists, which will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session with the audience. And before I introduce the first speaker, let me go through a few housekeeping matters. Your microphones will be muted throughout this session. As you listen to each presentation, I am sure you will have many questions for the speaker. Please do enter your questions into the Q&A box. Everyone in the audience will be able to see these questions, and you are also able to vote for the questions you would most like the panel to address. And you can vote by clicking on the thumbs up button. We will prioritize the questions accordingly. We will wait until all three speakers have given their presentations before we start our discussion. Okay, good. So this is exciting. I will first introduce our panelist, the first panelist of the day, and he is Dr. Hesri Adnan, who is a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. Dr. Adnan has a PhD in public policy from the Australian National University. He specializes in sustainable development solutions in areas including green economy and natural resources governance. Dr. Adnan served as a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel from 2015 to 2018. He was also the former CEO of the Langkawi Development Authority. Without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Adnan.
Thank you, Professor Koh, for that generous introduction. Greeting of peace to everyone, to my fellow panelists, Professor Field, and also Dr. Mark. It is a great pleasure to be with the panel today to deliberate on this very important topic of the changing climate and what are the challenges that will accrue from the interaction between water, food, and energy, which are the strategic resources that we have. As we know, the world is getting hotter, hungrier, and faster, as was coined by the World Economic Forum in the year 2011, I think. And if you look at the evolution of the population growth, in around the year 1800, there were only about 1 billion people living on the planet. And I think at that time, there was only one mega city in the world, which was Beijing. And fast forward to 2020, we now have about 7.8 billion people living on the planet. And then it is expected that by the year 2050, there will be an additional of about 2 billion people more, that will be living on the planet. And to feed the growing population of the Earth, as Professor Koh mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, we need to produce food by anywhere from 50 to 70% of from the current 2005 level, And of course, to produce food is one thing, and then you also have to produce more energy. About 40% more energy is needed to power the economy around 2050. And here's the rub. By 2030, we are expecting a global water deficit by about 40%. And we know for a fact that we need water to produce energy, we need water to produce food. This is the kind of situation that we are in. And this sets the scene for a global discourse on water, food, energy nexus, the interaction between the three resources. You can see from the slide here, there's a lot of global meetings had taken place from around early 2010 until recently in 2020 and 2021. We still have a series of discussions on the importance of looking at the strategic resources in an integrated manner. We started with a global framing at the World Economic Forum, where the risk associated with the insecurity or scarcity of water, food, and energy was highlighted. And this sort of led to a series of global meetings. And in 2011, around November, the German government has proposed the idea of looking at water, food, energy nexus as a solution for a green economy. And this sets the discussion for the Rio Plus 20 meeting in Johannesburg. So, and from then we can see from here that there was a number of those meetings, including, I think the King of Sweden even convened a meeting of experts to discuss on this. And if you Google, this was a couple of days ago, I Googled the phrase water, energy, food nexus, and we received about 228,000 hits. And that shows the interest around the topic, And this also has, this interest on water, food, energy nexus has also spurred the interest among academia, among the global organizations, to produce reports and academic studies on the nexus. And this conceptual search has, if you look at the academic publication, I think there are about over 600 academic publications that you can see that they are mainly revolve around countries. It cuts across the case studies you can be found across the world, but you can see the concentration of research is heavily skewed towards water and energy. And then 11 of the case studies, this is from the group of research based in Kyoto University, but they have a research team all over the Pacific region, Asian Pacific region. And a lot of studies were focusing on water and energy, and then water, food, and energy nexus. In the next slide, please. You can see that most of the research centers that look at the water, food, energy nexus are actually located in the north. So the places of nexus knowledge production are mainly in the north and also Australia. But the focus of the case studies revolve mainly in South Asia and also Southeast Asia. That's very interesting how these focus have sort of evolved over the years. And from this over 600 academic publications and perhaps thousands of other reports on nexus, you can see there are many frameworks. It's not just water, food, and energy. It is also focusing on other resources as well. For instance, in the work by the World Economic Forum in 2011, climate change was part of the nexus that was highlighted. And the report by Transatlantic Academy even went further than that by looking at the minerals, food, water, energy, and land nexus. In fact, by focusing on land, it will also, I think, link up to other important components of resources. For instance, if you look at land security, land should be very important for agriculture, for mining, for biodiversity, and also human settlements. So there are different ways of looking at how these resources are interconnected, but for the sake of discussion today, we just focus on water, food, and energy. And the reason is very obvious, as been stated by Professor Koh in the beginning, that all these resources are very essential to human life, and they are all interconnected. We need water to make crops grow. We need water to produce our energy. We also need energy to treat and move water. And if you look at the statistics or the studies embedded in all the research reports that I mentioned, the three resources are already in distress. And for a fact, we can say that energy is a very thirsty business. Thirsty energy is a term coined by one of the World Bank reports. 580 billion cubic meters of water is needed for energy production annually. And not the Olympic is coming our way, we would require about, this is equivalent to about 200 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. That's how much water we need to produce energy every year, just to put it in the scale. three examples of different types of energy production here. One is the hydropower energy production in the Citarum River Basin in Indonesia. It's on the left-hand side, which is a very important water basin in Indonesia, particularly in Java, because it provides not just energy, but also potable water supply and also irrigation source for the region surrounding Bandung, which is a big city in Indonesia, and also Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. And the Jatiluhur Dam is part of a cascading hydropower system, totaling about 1,500 megawatt of energy. And the Jatiluhur Dam in particular is the lowest in the cascading system of, in the highest one is Saguling Dam, Cirata, Saguling Dam is the highest, and then Cirata Dam, about 500 megawatt, and then Jatiluhur Dam. And this dam is very important because of the population pressure, because of the industrial emphasis within the western part of Java since the 1990s. And in fact, many industries were attracted to come, and particularly the textile industry were invited to come and develop their factories in within this basin in the 1990s because of the availability of cheap water. But things have changed since then. And we know for a fact that Bandung is a very important city for Indonesia. And in one report, it says that 40% of the GDP of Southeast Asia is actually concentrated within this area. So, but this area is also, this basin is beset with many challenges, environmental challenges. For instance, the Citarum River Basin. Citarum River itself is the most polluted river in Indonesia, and it collected yearly about 500,000 meter cube of garbage every year. So there is a tension between the competing demands for energy, water for energy, water for food, and water for water supply. And this is going to continue as we move towards 2050, And the challenge is that when there's all this problem with climate change, for instance, in 2010, excessive water has entered the Citarum Reservoir, these three reservoirs, and it has caused a very serious flooding issue within the downstream basin. Yeah? And the drought that has happened around the same time, the year after that, has also decreased the generating capacity of the Saguling and Cirata power plant, with the estimated financial loss of about $51 million for that year alone. So it is a very serious problem. The picture in the middle is a coal-fired power plant. It's a very, very big, very strategic power plant for Peninsular Malaysia. It, I think, produces, the installed capacity now is about 4,000 megawatt. And it is also dependent on treated water supply within the Perak River Basin, which is increasingly challenged by pollution issues. And then you also have the sugar power plant in the northeast of Thailand, Khon Kaen. This is one of the renewable energy bioplants that's being developed by the Thai government, the industry side. In 2010, President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo had declared a power crisis in southern Thailand and Mindanao because of the hydroelectric plants were providing only half of the electricity demanded because of the water shortage in that region. And food is also hungry for water and energy. For every steak that we consume, it will require around 3,000 liters of water. And 1 pound of steak also requires about 32 kilowatt hour of energy. We compare that with chicken, it's 10 times more what is energy needed to produce chicken. But perhaps what is more challenging for our region is the production of the cultivation of rice. We need about 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice. And this consumes about 30 to 40% of world's fresh water. So what are the solutions? One solution is drip irrigation, which is being now experimented in India and also in Thailand. So if you look at the discourse on water, food, and energy, you're actually looking at the different framing or dimension. One is, of course, sustainability. There's also concern about the livelihoods of people, so energy for livelihood, food for livelihood, that sort of thing. There's also a focus on the climate. I mentioned about some of the impact on the ground. And the Nexus approach is also seen as a solution for green economy. There's a lot of focus by the academic fraternity on how to model the interaction between water, food, and energy. And of course, the predominant concern is always the security, or rather the insecurity of these resources as they interact. And if I have to pin down what are the key sort of ideas that revolve around the idea of Nexus, one is how do we optimize the three resources? Number two is how do you manage the trade-off and avert conflicts from this when these three resources interacted in practice? And how do you unlock these synergies? For instance, how to ensure decision makers, how to ensure that our decision that is made to improve rice supply does not impact other sectors too negatively. We faced this in Malaysia when we faced the food crisis around 2008, 2009. The government decided to create more granary areas without looking at whether we have enough water for it. And then if there are more granary areas needed, where is the best area? What energy and water efficient technology should we use? And for whose security are we concerned about? And what are the innovation and what business opportunities that can come from this focus? And of course, if you look at the question of security, there are hotspots around the world when it comes to the when these three resources interact. For instance, shale gas development in the United States happened in water stressed area. And then in Central Asia, you have the tension between the upstream state and downstream states when it comes to energy production or hydropower production. And then in Gujarat, India, some of the banks have gone bankrupt because of the groundwater pumping credit system. And of course, we look at some good examples as well, where Singapore has always been treated as a successful case study of turning water insecurity into innovation. Singapore now can be, some people say that it is now the Silicon Valley for water industry. And Japan is known as a resource efficiency powerhouse, a market leader in this area. And China is also beset with many challenges related to water insecurity. And similarly, if you look at the Southeast Asia, particularly in continental Southeast Asia, the question of energy and food security is hotly debated because of the development of hydropower dams on the upstream and how it impacted the downstream states, particularly some of the places, for instance, Lake Tonle faces a reduction of fish catch because of the upstream development of hydropower. Next slide. Similarly, if you look around the region, you can begin to spot a number of challenges that we have to pay attention to. Biofuel, for instance, water, food, and vegetable farming in Malaysia, Myanmar's and energy projects. We all invite some serious look at how these three resources interacted. If you look at the solutions, I think I highlighted in the key takeaways that we are still thin on the actual solutions, but there is a framework on how governments have addressed or beginning to address. I think a lot of it revolved around the area of water efficiency, water reuse, and agricultural productivity, a sort of focus on renewable energy. But what is most important, next slide, is the focus on creating a platform for discussion, how we can reduce the address the conflicts, address the trade-off. And this is one example from a this is going to be my second last slide. One example from a paddy producing region in Peninsular Malaysia. Bukit Merah is also known for its tourist attraction. One of the earliest dams, I think the earliest dam that was water supply dam that was created in Peninsular Malaysia has now is now faced with this issue of the dam drying up. Yeah, and for many years there was also a thriving arowana fish or ornamental fish breeding industry in this area, but has moved away because of the problem with water. And this was exacerbated by the problem of global warming in around 2014. So to sum up, The framing of discourse on water food energy nexus focuses on the input output of resources, how much we use for water, how much water we need for energy and food production. And then we look at what are the trade-offs and what synergies can be found and what are the optimal policies. But most importantly, we need the creation of a platform on who and how should we govern these resources. To sum up, Nexus is an analytical approach. It is an emerging discourse. It is also a governance framework with emphasis on looking at how we can avoid the problem of silos in managing the tree's resources. What is also important is to localize and contextualize the Nexus assessment at a sub-national level. So it's important to look at it at national level, but what is more important is to look at the water, perhaps at a water as a river basin level, where we are experimenting with this in Malaysia now. And creation of a governance platform is very important, involving private, public, and also the community leadership, so that we can move from thinking about watersheds to now problem sheds. Professor Koh, sorry for taking more time than I should, but I should just stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adnan. We will hold our discussion until after all the speakers have finished their presentations. For now, I will move on and introduce our second panelist and speaker. She is Associate Professor Catherine Mak from the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. Professor Mak's research assesses climate change risks and response options to address increased flooding, extreme heat, wildfire, and other hazards. She is the 2020 recipient of the Piers Dallal Prize for world-leading contribution to solution-focused climate research. Professor Mak was co-director of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2010 to 2015. With that, I'll give the floor to Professor Mak.
Thank you so much, Professor Koh, and it's really an honor to speak with all of you today. I can't believe how many people are listening to this session. So what I'll be doing is really positioning the food, energy, water nexus, the resource challenges for Southeast Asia in a global view of the current status of climate change risks and how people globally are responding to deal with them, to make sure nature and people are safe moving forward. So where are we now in the climate challenge? The globe as a whole has warmed about 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times. Is that a lot? The really key thing is that this is a substantial amount compared to our experiences historically. We are seeing impacts for food production, for water quality and availability, for human health and well-being, livelihoods on every single continent. And we're really at a key turning point in terms of what future we have ahead in terms of the amount of climate change that occurs and the nature of the impacts that we'll need to grapple with. In the bottom right image is a world of continued high emissions, one that could take us to above 4 degrees Celsius temperature increase by the end of the century and beyond. That is a world that is so far outside of our experiences historically that it's really hard to know exactly how we will grapple. By contrast, the bottom left world is one where we, as a global community, succeed in reducing emissions of heat-trapping gases, limit warming below 2 degrees Celsius, pursuing 1.5, and one where there will be potentially twice as much or more in terms of the nature of the impacts we need to deal with, but one where the prospects for preparing and adapting are much more hopeful. Increasingly through time, there has been a huge emphasis on risks in a changing climate. Understanding these risks that are all about interconnections, complexities, the nexus of food, energy, and water, but also where our understanding of the challenges link directly with solutions. And these are solutions that we are increasingly seeing in real time. And the really important way to think about this is that as the climate changes, yes, there are hazards, floods, fires, drought, heat waves, but these hazards aren't enough to create impacts that matter in isolation. It's really a question of what's in the path of harm. How well have we prepared and planned, kept hazards out, or accommodated them in real time? In this space of climate change risk, what we are increasingly seeing is an emphasis on our focus today, the interconnections. When we think about what is really hard to deal with in real time, as Professor Adnan described, it's not just the fact that there are impacts on food production. It's not just the impacts on water production or water availability. It is really how these interact and how those interactions carry consequences for people and really produce surprises where we don't necessarily have the capabilities to adapt in advance to know what's coming down the pipeline. The second image here really demonstrates that there is a big dependency through time as well. The actions today we take really matter, not just for us in the next few years ahead, they matter for the next generation. They matter for people across the world, our third spatial interaction here in panel C. And one where increasingly our choices about how we adapt are interacting with the impacts in real time. So against this backdrop of interactions, this is really where global responses stand right now. How do we deal with these interactions that are really where the impacts that matter arise, where we don't necessarily foresee in advance everything that's going to happen, and that really put pressure on many of our systems of government, where oftentimes the goal has been stability, not necessarily the nimbleness needed to grapple with these interconnections unfolding in surprising ways, complexly through time. So what are some of the biggest impacts to have on the radar? A lot of them arise in the space of water and flooding, with wide open questions, for example, around how much sea level rise will occur over the course of this century. These have large impacts for coastal systems, yes, from direct flooding, but also from the way that saline water pushes inland and really affects our ability to have agriculture in coastal regions. We also see very complex impacts emerging where things like the food, energy, water nexus are center stage when we think about the stability of societies and how climate usually matters a little bit everywhere. And when it comes to economic shocks or dependencies on resources, we're not just talking little bitty impacts, we're talking about impacts that can reverberate very broadly and affect conflict, in some cases at very large scales. Adding up all of these impacts that matter, there is a framework that has been used again and again, and it is currently being extended in the current assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for its 6th assessment report, coming out of several special reports on land, oceans, and also 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And this framework really emphasizes that when it comes to impacts we need to be thinking about, there are 5 different categories of risk. The first one here relates to systems that may not extend very far geographically, but that are acutely affected as the climate continues to change. Systems like coral reefs or low-lying small island states, where the impacts are moderate at present and growing very rapidly with additional warming. The second reason for concern in a changing climate is the degree to which we see extremes as revealing profound vulnerabilities that exist oftentimes when it's a cyclone or a drought or a fire. It's not just small impacts on the margins, it's life and death. It's impacts that last for many months and sometimes years into the future. The third category of risk in a changing climate that's been emphasized by the IPCC for decades now has everything to do with food and water security, and it's the distribution of impacts. How some people will be fine, they have the finances to get food from somewhere. Many people will not. And this third category really is that unfairness factor of a changing climate. The fourth category of risk that we need to manage when it comes to interconnections is how these add up to economic impacts at a regional scale, at a global scale. And the last one here is that potential for surprises. Just how much sea level rise will happen, how well will forests do in a changing climate? There are wide open uncertainties there. So when it comes to managing these risks, grappling with the nexus issue, what's the current state of policy, of action across social scales, local government, national government, to global collaboration? I'll get to the global assessment happening for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change starting in the next slide, but I'll start with a personal view, one that I've been thinking through a lot over the last year and a half. When it comes to some challenges where our scientific understanding has a big role for how societies respond, we have a lot of policy infrastructure that already exists. So for example, when it comes to the pandemic, I think this point, probably all of us are familiar with the World Health Organization. For me, at the University of Miami, this reverberates through the national counterpart, the local counterpart, and this is really operationalized science, specific guidance, plans that have been developed over decades. By contrast, when we think about climate change and how we grapple the food, water, energy nexus in real time, the key distinction is that a lot of this is emerging. Yes, there's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but that's much higher level than something like the World Health Organization about crucially important questions of finance, but not necessarily specifically about what people can and should do on a daily basis. In many national governments, why I've got the empty middle here, there really is no single agency of government responsible for grappling with climate change risk. That is changing in a few countries, including in Southeast Asia as a whole, but one where that's a huge gap globally. And then as Professor Anand described, really at the local level, we're seeing different governments, people, communities starting to grapple with the changing risks they're seeing, doing something. And it is really this intersection of all of these different social levels that becomes fascinating as we think about how climate responses are emerging right now. So with this as the backdrop, really realizing that climate responses are emerging, the current assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is doing something pretty unique, and it is looking for every single adaptation action. So basically an action that is being taken to prepare for climate risks in real time, and looking at every single documented adaptation action globally. What we see in these very big regional categories, because this is a global assessment, is that the food, water, energy nexus is very relevant to actions we're seeing in Asia as a whole, clearly a vast region with over 50 countries. But food is the most important priority emerging across all of the preparedness actions we see in response to the changing climate right now. Health, poverty, huge issues as well. And even though water is smaller across Asia as a whole compared to some of these other priorities, it is the largest region in terms of its emphasis on water in climate change responses right now. The next question becomes, well, what climate hazards are relevant? And here I think is a really interesting point. Basically, all of them are. When we think about how we deal with the changing climate, it's drought, it's rainfall, it's flooding, it's heat, it's sea level rise, and it's all of those put together. And that complexity is really why these nexus issues become so interconnected so quickly. For example, not just when you have an issue of rainfall or a season with particularly high fire, it's when all of those things happen in a single year, for example. And the last component here for this slide is who is taking action, grappling with the food, water, energy nexus with climate risks as a whole. And what's pretty interesting is that most of the documented action is very small scale. It's individual farmers taking action. It's people at the dinner table figuring out how they'll keep their business going. It's local governments realizing they've got a problem. But it is these higher levels of government, national level, global cooperation, where we're just starting to see more action emerging. And through time, it'll be those coordinations across levels of government, across organizations in society, across the private sector, that are really crucially important to dealing with climate risk well. This next slide is a little bit abstract, but what I'll describe here is major categories of responses that are emerging through time. So the largest red ring here is very small scale behavioral adaptation, or things that communities are doing to grapple with climate risks. That's the biggest circle globally, and it's also the response we see most often across Asia. And what that's really saying is it's farmers, it's communities, it's households taking action, basically anywhere you look. Some of these other rings that are smaller are areas of crucially important growth. How do we see the integration of nature-based solutions, technological adaptations, institutions across those global scales? And as we see these rings evolve through time, I'm guessing that some of these rings that are smaller, the green, the blue, the gray, will be growing outwards through time as they become a bigger part of the solution space moving forward. And then finally, the Sustainable Development Goals that were mentioned by Professor Koh at the start are crucially integrated with climate change responses as well. There is no way to show all of them at once, so I'm doing a very abstract slide here, really emphasizing that the black box here shows the relative prevalence of these different sustainable development goals on the left of the slide as relevant to drivers of climate change vulnerability and climate change responses in Asia. And what we see for the food, energy, water nexus is this profound interconnection with food security, reducing and eliminating hunger, with clean water and sanitation, the way that these interactions are the foundation of economies in urban and rural areas, and really the reduction of poverty crucially depends upon them. So moving forward, I think we'll see lots of advances in the nature of climate change responses occurring in Southeast Asia and the globe as a whole. I personally think about some of the ones that have been the hardest end of climate responses to date. So things like realizing one really good way to reduce risks when it comes to coastal areas being inundated or rivers overtopping is to move out of the way. So this relatively crazy concept of retreating from the most hazardous locations is one where it's starting to enter into the picture, recognizing that we need a whole lot of options coming together, keeping water out, making sure buildings stay cool in the hottest times of day, that agricultural workers are protected, and recognizing that this diversity of actions that we're seeing globally is really an harbinger of the type of innovation we'll see moving forward, recognizing that when it comes to something as hard as managed retreat, we see many of the innovations where to date, sometimes the way we have gotten people out of the way is given them a check, but into the future, we're seeing a lot more coordination, a lot more attention to all of the social objectives affected, like the cohesion of communities, social justice, and one where this really requires partnerships, and something that we're seeing absolutely globally, documented in all of those adaptations for the current assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is that the producers of understanding on climate change are coming together with governments, with communities, to really figure out how we can ask questions together, how we can innovate into the unknown, and how this has to be a very collaborative process. So the last slide I'll end with is just this reminder that our prospects for dealing with climate risks and impacts in real time, the complex food, water, energy nexus, fundamentally depends on whether we're heading towards the left world in the bottom here, one where the global community comes together in reducing emissions of heat-trapping gases, or one of continuing climate change that becomes increasingly difficult to manage. I will look forward to the discussion coming up after the next presentation, and please feel free to reach out to me at any time.
Thank you so much, Professor Mark. I see that we have been getting quite a few questions. Please do keep the questions coming, have them entered into the Q&A box, and all three speakers will address the questions later on. Our third panelist today is Professor Chris Field, who is the Faculty Director at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Professor Field's climate change research focuses on solutions that improve lives, decrease the amount of future warming, and support vibrant economies. He is deeply involved in national and international efforts to advance our understanding of global ecology and change. Professor Field served as co-chair of the Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2008 to 2015. Without further ado, let me welcome Professor Field to speak to us.
Thank you, Professor Koh, and thanks to the earlier speakers for really laying out the fundamentals of the core of the climate challenge. What I'd like to do is focus a little bit more on solutions and a particular set of solutions. Those that recognize that we need water for energy, as you've already heard. We need water for food production. We also need non-polluting energy in order to tackle the climate crisis effectively. And those really come together most uniquely, I would argue, in the area of hydropower, using dams or other in-river generation systems to produce electricity. And I want to talk about hydropower, especially in Asia, in the context of the water, energy, food nexus. This is a photograph of the Three Gorges Dam. It produces over 6 gigawatts of electricity, really critically dependent on having river flows that are sufficient but we're also critically dependent on having access to hydropower if we're going to be able to mobilize the non-emitting sources that we need in order to fight climate change. If you look at the sources of electricity in the current world, and the frustrating reality is that fossil fuels are still the dominant source, accounting for something on the order of 70%. Nuclear accounts for about 13% globally. Renewables are just a little more than 2%. And hydropower is a big slice. Hydropower is about 16% of total global electricity. And it's an amount that is expected to increase into the future. We currently produce about 1,300 gigawatts of hydropower, and by 2040, that's expected to be almost 2,000 gigawatts. So the question that I want to address with all of you is how we fit this need for hydropower in the context of a global future in which we see increasing demands on water resources and increasing threats to water resources from a changing climate. The spatial distribution of where we have hydropower now is heavily dominated by hydropower installations in China, which has over 370 gigawatts. But many countries rely critically on hydropower for their electricity resources, and will increasingly in the future, because hydropower has the unique ability to be turned up and turned down as needed, which is especially valuable in the context of a renewable heavy energy system, one where you can't always count on the wind blowing, and we know with high predictability that the sun doesn't shine all the time. So the real question is, how do we construct a future energy system that provides high confidence in providing the electricity that people need in order to have vibrant economies and robust communities? At the same time, we recognize the threats to the world's water resources. The extent to which we already face profound threats is really illustrated in this map of the world's free-flowing rivers, where rivers that are shown in blue are basically free-flowing, and rivers that are shown in orange and red are basically heavily impacted. And what you can see is that in large parts of the world, much of China, much of India, much of Europe, and much of North America, essentially all the rivers are already heavily impacted by dams and other structures that prevent the water from flowing freely. But there are a few parts of the world where there are still amazing river assets left for nature, and many of these really need to be protected. There are some important parts of South Asia that still have free-flowing rivers, especially in the upper Mekong watershed. But as Professor Adnan showed, there are already many dams that are planned or under construction. But when you look at the potential for the construction of future dams in order to provide more hydropower, that distribution is very non-uniform around the world. In terms of the extent to which the hydropower potential is already tapped, about 3/4 of it has already been used in Europe. More than 2/3 has already been used in North America, but only 7% has been utilized in Africa. About 33% has been utilized in South America, and only 22% has been utilized in Asia. When we look at the challenge moving forward of how to balance the great need for water as a resource for irrigation and for hydropower, at the same time, we're looking at the great need for the environmental benefits of free-flowing rivers, we really face a series of profound challenges. How do we keep free-flowing rivers, and how do we meet an expanding need for hydropower? If you look at where dams are currently planned or under construction, see that a lot of the dam building activity is in Asia, especially in China. and many of the planned dams are also in China. So we really have not only increasing risk of ecological impacts of dams that are under construction, but we also have an important lever to control the way that future trajectories go based on how future dams are constructed and what their implications are. I want to share an approach that we've been working on at Stanford to advancing the dialogue about the way to integrate hydropower, river conservation, and water conservation into the global discussion about managing the impacts of climate change and providing renewable energy. And this is a picture of a New York Times article from October of last year, where the elements of this approach are outlined. And the basic idea is that in much of the world, we have many, many dams that we don't need. In much of the world, we have many dams that are being used for flood control or irrigation, but are not providing electricity when they could. And in other places, we have new efficient dams that are producing electricity at a useful rate and may have the potential for producing more or may not. But the fact that we have this wide array of available dam resources really points to a path forward. And it's a path forward that we call the 3 R's: retrofit, rehabilitate, or remove. Retrofit takes the dams that are already producing electricity and can be an important part of the electricity system and increases the potential they have to generate by adding newer generation capacity or increasing the total amount of generation. Retrofit means taking dams that were designed for something other than hydropower, and where it's a dam that's meeting important needs in terms of water security for food production or for direct human use, to add hydropower to those. And remove is a really critical part of this agenda, and it's focused on recognizing that there are lots of places in the world where the environmental benefits of restoring free-flowing rivers are substantially greater than the impacts of the removing the dam, and that if we have an aggressive program of dam removal, we can complement the retrofit and rehabilitate components of the 3 R's. We've been pleased to work with a wide range of stakeholders, all the way from conservation groups to hydropower associations to the to kayaking enthusiasts, to put together what we think is going to be a high traction program, not only in North America, but around the world, to bring to bear the potential that we have for hydropower to really be a critical part of the energy future, at the same time that we don't have to sacrifice the important values that are provided by free-flowing rivers. When I look at the solutions to the nexus that this offers, there are really 3 important components that need to be our guiding lights. The first is that we need to put a maximum effort into protecting free-flowing rivers. That doesn't mean there should be no dams on the river system, but what it really means is that the dam should be in the upstream areas and the tributaries and not in the mainstream, so that to the extent possible, the main stem rivers can run wild and free. We also should recognize that rivers aren't the only way that we can generate hydroelectricity. And there are many dams now that operate by pumping water uphill into the reservoir when electricity is abundant and allowing it to flow down through the turbines when there's a need for electricity. And in the geographies that allow this, where there are appropriate gradients and basins, pumped hydro can be a wonderful complement to other energy sources in a way that allows us to limit the amount of new dams we need to build, essentially by getting double duty out of the dams we've got. The other thing that we need to do is start valuing reservoirs for their best use and not working with a system where we have so many single purpose reservoirs, where reservoirs used for flood protection only, or for water storage only, or for electricity generation only. And we have abundant scholarship to be able to do sophisticated algorithms for managing water storage, flood protection, and dispatchable electricity at the same time. And we need to start doing that rather than thinking that we have an unlimited potential to space dams across the landscape and to have them used for single purposes. And then finally, we need to design for climate change. Professor Mak and Professor Adnan have already talked about the extent to which a changing climate means not only drier conditions in some places and wetter conditions in others, but it also means increased variability. And one of the most striking features about the water systems in the rich countries versus in the poor countries is that the rich countries have massive, typically 3 or more years of water storage in reservoirs, and poor countries typically have on the order of 100 days of water storage in reservoirs. And one of the things that we need to do in an era of increased climate variability is put a lot more emphasis on designing for that variability, as Professor Mak has already emphasized, and recognizing that water storage is really going to be a key part of that. The climate, energy, water, food nexus has got so many dimensions, but it also provides lots of opportunities for creative solutions. Some of those involve technology, some of them involve behavioral changes, and some of them involve just getting ahead of the curve so that instead of trying to deal with the last year's disaster, we're really projecting our efforts to create the infrastructure to deal with next year's challenges. This kind of forum that we've had today is a spectacular setting for starting those kinds of conversations. And I hope that everyone's heard many good ideas for moving forward in a way that we can not only confront the climate challenge, but emerge with a better society at the end. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Professor Field. Before we start our panel discussion, may I remind and encourage the audience to continue to key in your questions in the Q&A box, and also to vote for your favorite questions by clicking on the thumbs up button. Good, so for the next 15 minutes, we will move on to have our panel discussion. To talk about some of the ideas and concepts that the various speakers brought up during their individual sessions. Perhaps I can start with a question just to follow up on Professor Field's short but very insightful lecture on what hydropower or dams. Now, Professor Field mentioned that that there could be potential environmental impacts resulting from the construction of dams for the production of hydropower. That is clearly an example of a trade-off between using dams to help safeguard and ensure our water and energy security on the one hand, and environmental protection on the other. Professor Field also talked about some of the possible solutions that may reduce some of these trade-offs. But I was wondering, apart from thinking about trade-offs and their solutions, there may also be synergistic positive externalities, the good things that could come out of hydropower and dams that could potentially help address some of the other priorities of society. So I'm really interested to hear from Professor Field, but also from Professor Mak and Dr. Adnan, if they have any ideas or suggestions from their own learnings on what some of these positive outcomes might be from developing hydropower. Maybe we can start with Professor Field.
Yeah, thank you for the question. You know, I have always been an environmentalist, and I would say that the sort of entry ticket to be an environmentalist, especially in the US, has been being opposed to dams. And I find myself really surprised making a presentation that advocates for embracing dams as a part of the solution. But I think they really can be. And I think that the key is that we don't really need more dams. We need better dams. We need to get rid of a lot of dams. We need to make sure that when we build dams, they're in the right places and they do the right things. And we also really need to plan around the expectation of climate change. And, you know, in the United States now, we're in what many people are calling a mega drought, and we're seeing the major reservoirs on the Colorado River fall to such low levels that the pipes that deliver the water to major cities are now above the water level. We face a genuine crisis related to designing the water system for a past climate regime. So I think some of the benefits that we could achieve by planning better are making sure that we're addressing water insecurity by providing sufficient storage, recognizing that the water system is a lot more than dams and that underground storage is a really critical part of it. And when we look at food production, we can gain a lot by taking advantage of using cropland areas as aquifer recharge. I just close with one thought that I think could really help stimulate solutions, and that's that covering some reservoirs with floating photovoltaics provides a win-win-win in terms of keeping the photovoltaics cool, limiting the amount of evaporation that occurs from large reservoirs, and providing something close to 24-hour power, because the photovoltaics can provide the power during the day and the dams at night. And there are lots of things like that if we think hard enough, we can come up with creative ways to address the climate challenge.
Thanks so much, Professor Field. Yeah, talking about PVs in reservoirs, I think that's something Singapore is investing very heavily in, and it's exactly the kind of creative solutions that could potentially resolve a lot of our challenges. But I'm sure that also it would also create new questions or generate new questions and challenges that we also have to consider. But obviously, it's good for the research fraternity because that just gives us more work to do and more interesting problems to tackle. I wonder if Professor Mark would have any additional insights to share on this question.
Yeah, excellent. So I am not a hydropower expert, so I won't take this specifically around hydropower, but to me, a point that really reverberates strongly is that when it comes to reducing emissions of heat-trapping gases or grappling with the risks unfolding in real time, there is no perfect solution. And so again and again, it is all about managing trade-offs, whether it's, how we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, planting trees, or direct air capture. That example of retreat that I gave, they all have harms and benefits. And I think really there is almost like this easy tendency to say if something has any downsides, it's off the table, but we will get nowhere if we take things with downsides off the table because we will be left with nothing else. So I think for many of these examples, and hydropower would be an excellent one, governance is really key. How are societies managing these trade-offs? We need to be really deliberate and careful about that.
Thanks a lot, Professor Mark. Dr. Adnan, do you have more to add?
Yep. Thank you, Professor Field, for bringing up this very important solution to the fore. Of course, in some countries, the potential for more hydropower solution is quite limited. For instance, Malaysia, but Having said that, we're not just focusing. We shouldn't just be focusing on the the main stem of the rivers. The tributaries themselves can be tapped for mini hydro or micro hydro, which will benefit, perhaps could be linked to hydrogen economy for some of the countries that are interested in it. And I mentioned in my presentation about the Chirata Dam within the Citarum River Basin. They are already added about 145 megawatt floating solar panel on that dam. So that move is already happening in Southeast Asia and also in Thailand to some extent. Malaysia is a bit more conservative on that, which brings me to the other question about the politics of energy transition. There's always vested interest in each of these technology choice. And I think this is where I kept on harping on the need to bring up creating a platform where we can bring everybody together to iron out what are the pros and cons of moving into certain direction, and to make sure that everybody would have a piece of cake, a piece of the the unfolding technology solution. So I would also agree with that, but of course we have to look at the environmental component as well. Of course, large dam will involve the resettling of communities and all that, which I think every country has gone through that phase before.
Thanks, Dr. Anand. Just to follow on that point about how we might need to work together, the various actors and stakeholders might need to work together. I have a question about one of the slides you showed, Dr. Anand, where you displayed a map of the potential water, energy, and food nexus challenges across Southeast Asia, or actually across Asia. And that map made me wonder about the importance and the value of considering this water, energy, and food nexus at both the regional level and also at the local level, and whether there are any you have any thoughts on how we should even begin to think about tackling some of the challenges at the local versus regional level, as well as some of the opportunities that we could potentially capitalize on. And I think this also relates to the most highly voted question posed by the audience, which I think we can also address at the same time. That question asks, how would countries without land to produce food and water be able to compete in this supply of security? In other words, be able to address the issues of food security, water security, and energy security. I guess the overarching question is this consideration of local versus regional solutioning and also in terms of capitalizing on the opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Koh. That is really the million-dollar question, right? I mean, how do you organize the groupings of decision makers at a different level? Of course, it has to happen in in all capacities, all forums that's possible. But in terms of water, food, and energy nexus, particularly in continental Southeast Asia, we've got the Mekong River Commission being the house of a lot of these activities that brings together the countries that are involved. So there is a natural platform for that to happen. Of course, it will be more difficult when you think about the archipelagic side of Southeast Asia. To a small level, the energy is it Singapore International Energy Week or something like that is a platform, has been a platform where academics, business sector, and other players have come together to discuss about the potential solution for energy and also water. I've been involved in some of the discussion in the past few years. So perhaps the other platform that we should consider, but of course there's a lot of challenge in pushing this idea, is ASEAN itself as a platform where these issues can be brought together. There was an attempt many years ago to look at ASEAN energy market integration, an initiative that was based in Chulalongkorn University, where about 10 energy economies were brought together, and we organized enough material to discuss this, and we interacted with the SOME senior energy ministers, energy officials platform. So, but this takes a lot of effort to sustain it. So, there are platforms, but I think there needs to be some policy brokers involved to bring this together as a sort of as a package of information, and then for it to be ironed out in a more formal platform. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Anand. Wonder if Professor Field and Professor Mark have more to add to this?
When I think about Singapore, the thing that I'm reminded of is your starting comment about the success that Singapore's had with producing fresh drinkable water. And I think that there are wonderful opportunities for technology. But when we really look at security across the food, energy, water nexus, it's really hard to see how it evolves in a stable way without a greater emphasis on international cooperation, especially for small countries. And one of the things that I worry a lot about is the tendency to set aside an emphasis on internationalism and go the one nation way. And I think that as much as we need creative community-based solutions, we also need a future with more international cooperation than we've seen in recent years.
Great. And then the only thing that I would add is that, as Professor Field described and as Dr. Anand unfolded, there are locations in the world where you can look to remarkable innovation and economic success with a very small land footprint. At present, Singapore perhaps being the globally leading example. But to that theme of the international dimensions of the issue, I think it's also crucially important to recognize that there are some countries that have historically had adequate land for agriculture, adequate fresh water, and that's rapidly changing. So for example, the coastal megadelta regions, low-lying small island states, those are regions of the world where the need to figure out food and water with a rapidly changing food and water base is crucially important, and where in some cases there are resources available domestically to deal with the immense issues, and in other cases there are not. And really bringing people together, yes, local and regional, but local, regional, global becomes crucially important.
Thanks, Professor Mark. So talking about research and innovation, I think that's another interesting topic. Maybe we can have just tackle that as the last question of the panel discussion. Dr. Anand mentioned that there have been an increasing number of publications on Nexus research in recent years. So I'm wondering, and this is a question to all three panelists, I'm wondering to what extent these research or these studies or the findings of this research have actually been taken up by governments and corporates to inform their policy and business decision. Or as Professor Mark put it, how do we operationalize the science even more, I suppose? Maybe that would involve nudging or incentivizing academics to shift their mode of operation towards more engaged forms of research and engage with respect to the public and private sectors. And also another related question is how early on in their careers should this idea be instilled in their training of these early career researchers? Perhaps also how can funders, university administrators, and our academic institution as a whole help to support this? Yeah, maybe Professor Mark can start since you are already. Yeah.
Perfect. I was still scribbling notes on so many themes that come to mind. Yeah, no, I think that's the billion-dollar question when it comes to the climate issue, and how to get towards science that is actionable and usable. Absolutely, as you described, Professor Koh, the role of funding, the role of national priorities, the role of global priorities, crucially important. But I actually will even point to one of the next questions coming up here that is speaking to the issues of kind of the limits of individual behavior. And it's actually that theme that comes to mind when I think about how do we get to a world where science is operationalized. There is so much that scientists can do, but also at this point, this is a question of advocacy, and kids yelling at politicians can be much more effective than wonky scientists in surprising ways. How do we get to a world where there are new norms? So when you think about eating that steak that Dr. Anand described, you might think twice because of what your peers think of you. So a lot of this is actually, really about how societies function and the role of politics and the role of finance and the role of cooperation. And so even just that narrow angle on the science, I think, is in powerful, riveting ways, deeply interconnected with the entire workings of communities and societies globally.
Hey, thanks, Professor Mark. Professor Field, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. There's a very large sense in which tackling the climate crisis is about mobilizing action at all levels, from individuals to companies to nations to the international community, as Professor Mak has outlined. And I think for too long, there has been a kind of a counter narrative that said, well, maybe we should just wait a little longer because the science and technology will come up with solutions that we can deploy more cheaply or with fewer environmental consequences. And I think that it's clear that we still need important technologies, and there are important gaps in the portfolio of solutions. But the main thing we need is an increase in the commitment of entities, all the way from individuals to nations, to be involved. And the activism that Professor Mak has described is really critical for that. But I do think there's one really important thing that's come from recent scholarship that we've discussed this today that can be built on. And it's this issue of the interconnectedness of all the problems, not only in the water, energy, food nexus, but also with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think where science has a huge opportunity to be helpful in providing compelling solutions is to identify where there are trade-offs that can work to people's advantage, where there are negative trade-offs, and where there are unacceptable levels of risk. And I think that the scientists of the future should definitely have a technology focus, but even more, they should have an integration focus and a risk management focus.
Thanks, Professor Field. Dr. Anand, do you have?
Yes, Professor Koh, with regard to the uptake of some of the research on water, food, and energy, I think we can see some traction with some groups that are have cleverly attached themselves to a decision-making body. For instance, a lot of this happening around the Mekong. The concentration of research activities to feed into the discourse on hydropower and its impact is quite astounding. And this is where I think the idea of co-production of knowledge is very important as we move forward. And this is where I think the younger generation of researchers should be made aware from early start that it is important to always engage the rest of the community. How do you do that is, of course, it varies with different contexts. Somehow from my interaction in Singapore, whenever there's an academic discussion, there's always generous interest from the public to come to some of these meetings and organize. So that is quite a healthy tradition that you have in Singapore. I don't know whether that can be replicated elsewhere. Maybe being in a small place has some merit to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Anand. Also thank all three panelists for a very engaging and informative panel discussion. I think we should move on to the Q&A session. We are running short of time. Let me try to maybe combine a few of these questions. The first one is about the fact that, given that our economy, our businesses are still largely carbon-based, and also given that that there are these conflicting demands on energy, on water and food, how would we be able to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement? I suppose this is my paraphrasing of the current most highly voted question. And related to that, perhaps another question asks if reducing demand could be something to emphasize a bit more in how we think about the solutions, or degrowth, I suppose, is another common concept. So I wonder if perhaps Professor Field might have something to say to this first.
You know, I'll go back to the point I made earlier, which is that we have the basic technologies that we need to solve the climate challenge. But there are other important reasons to decrease the human footprint on the environment. Those include assuring food security. They include assuring that there's sufficient space for other species. They allow just assuring the integrity of natural ecosystems. So there is a really important issue to address in reducing demand, and especially in being thoughtful about demand. But climate is fundamentally different. Climate is fundamentally about the technology for replacing polluting energy sources with non-polluting energy sources. And we have access to the technologies to do that now. And we should be doing it at a much faster pace than we're doing it. Efficiency can be an extremely important part of that. And if you think that reducing demand comes from increasing efficiency, that's a key part. But I also think it's important to recognize that there are aspects of our global predicament, the wicked problem that Dr. Adnan spoke about, that are fundamentally related to decreasing demand, and others that are fundamentally related to advancing technology solutions that replace one kind of energy with a different kind.
Thanks, Professor Field. And to that point, there's a related and rather pointed question. The question asks if nuclear power plants or nuclear power in general could be part of the solution. Go ahead.
It could be. You know, in recent years, what we've seen is that nuclear energy can't compete on price, and nuclear energy is the only energy technology that's gotten more expensive in recent decades. So I'm perfectly open to the idea that if we can produce nuclear power facilities that are safe and reliable and not subject to terrorism and affordable, they should be a part of the problem. I honestly don't see the technology going that way, but there's every reason to think that if the technology really can solve all those problems, we should welcome it into being a partner in climate change solutions.
Thanks, Professor Field. I think we should maybe just have our last question, and I would like to use it as a way for us to close this discussion. So I will ask the question and ask each of you to share your thoughts on it. I think it's quite a fitting question. The question is about the current pandemic. And my version of the question is to ask each of you, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your own thoughts around the challenges and the opportunities that we face as a global society with regards to climate change? Professor Field, do you want to go first?
A hard question. I was hoping I would have some more chance to think about the answer. One thing the pandemic has really shown me is the capability of our science and technology enterprise and the production of a large number of effective vaccines in many countries has really been a spectacular accomplishment. But it's also been striking how inequitably the vaccines are being distributed and how inequitably basic health infrastructure is being distributed. A really critical thread in tackling climate change is to produce equitable solutions and not just global scale solutions. And I think for me, more than anything else, what the pandemic has driven home is the importance of thinking globally and thinking about equity when we talk about solving any of the major challenges we face.
Thanks, Professor Field. Professor Mark?
Yeah, great. And I suspect this is a question we all have been thinking about endlessly as we've been, mostly confined to our homes for much of the last year and a half as this crisis has unfolded. I think one of the places I really started as the COVID pandemic was unfolding and the losses were catastrophic and inequitable is really thinking about how we talk about climate change risk and how we have thought about pandemic risks. It's something where, any pandemic plan would say that the first thing you do is you socially isolate and you confine people to their homes and you close schools. And in the abstract, that sounds like a sensible thing to do. It sounds like prudent risk management. And I think as all of us have lived the losses of this last year, we've realized what it's like to go through systemic catastrophic risks. And so for me, as we talk about climate change risk, they're also very abstract, they're very high level. But then when you realize, similarly, this is about people's lives and well-being and things we can do if we cooperate, in my mind, there's just a huge parallel there in terms of what it means to manage the risks of a changing climate well.
Thanks, Professor Mark. Dr. Anand?
The fact of life now is that the climate risk is real, pandemic risk is real. A few years ago, perhaps a decade or two ago, people who were harping on the importance of looking at climate risks, pandemic risks were labeled as Dr. Doom and Gloom. But now it's upon us now, and we are, in many countries, we are not prepared. The whole society is not prepared. I think it should instill in all of us that we all live in a risk society, and we should really take into account how our life can be changed easily by abrupt changes in the natural world.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. And with that, let me give my closing remarks by summarizing what we have learned today. So just very quickly, I only have 4 points, 3 or 4 points. The first is about resource security. I think as Dr. Anand mentioned in his opening presentation, resource security is a central problem for society's future well-being. This Nexus approach that we are discussing today is an important governance, implementation, and research framework to ward us off working in silos. And for us to understand and respond to the resource challenges of water, energy, and food in the face of climate change, we need to fully consider the interacting social, economic, and cultural factors that could influence the future vulnerability, exposure, and resource capacity of human and natural systems. As societies grapple and develop our solutions to these problems, there will always be trade-offs to consider. It is important to localize and contextualize our assessments of these trade-offs. At the same time, there may also be opportunities to achieve multiple goals at once. An example is the case of hydropower, which both Dr. Anand and Professor Field are focused on, where if we take a science-based approach to our decision-making on the location, the purpose, and design of these dams, there are opportunities to maximize their contributions to water and energy security, while also reducing the impacts on the environment. With that, I would like to bring this session to a close. This has been a really fantastic panel discussion, and we really have our fantastic panel of esteemed speakers to thank for it. Let me convey my deepest appreciation to Professor Chris Field, Associate Professor Catherine Mark, and Dr. Hesri Adnan for enlightening us with your deep knowledge of this subject. Also, on behalf of the panelists today and the co-organizers of this webinar series, I sincerely thank you, the audience, for spending the last hour and a half with us today. And may I remind the audience that In the Wake of a Changing Climate is a 4-part panel discussion series. Therefore, we invite you to join us for our upcoming sessions in the months of July, August, and September. The dates of these subsequent sessions will be confirmed in the near future. And with that, I thank you and I wish all of you a good rest of the day. Thank you so much.